So welcome again, everybody. We'll be talking about the Internet of Things. And our speakers tonight are going to be Mark Patel and William Saito. Mark Patel is a partner with McKinsey, and William Saito is a special advisor to the Cabinet Office of the Government of Japan. So a little bit more technical, we'll give you a little bit of an introduction to IoT. We'll talk about latest innovations, how IoT is making the difference, how companies are using IoT. And then in the panel, we will elaborate on those based on your questions and our additional thoughts. A few more words about Mark Patel. So he's in San Francisco office of McKinsey, where he co-leads the Internet of Things service line globally, as well as the advanced analytics and digital efforts in advanced industries and manufacturing. He's also one of the lead partners for semiconductor and biosystems practice groups. He has been working for McKinsey, but also for a couple of other companies that went public. He was part of the executive team that took Amiris, a leading company in synthetic biology, to the public market. He holds an MBA degree from Stanford University and a master's and bachelor's degree from the University of Cambridge in UK. Mr. William Saito is one of the Nikkei's 100 most influential people in Japan, was named the Entrepreneur of the Year in 1998, an authority on encryption, biometric authentication, and cybersecurity. He sold his company to Microsoft, went back to Tokyo, and he was also named a Chief Technology Officer of the Fukushima Nuclear Accident Independent Investigation Commission. In 2012, he has been appointed to a Council of National Strategy, reporting directly to the Prime Minister. He's active in the World Economic Forum and advises several national governments. He's currently the special advisor to the Cabinet Office, and he does write books as well. So these are our distinguished speakers. I think we can proceed with Mr. Patel as the first speaker.
So, first of all, thank you very much for inviting us to speak. I'm very privileged to be here and delighted to be here, and completely delighted to be talking about the Internet of Things, because it is what I'm passionate about. And I'm lucky to say that I'm both passionate about it and I'm able to spend my time working in the Internet of Things as well. I wanted to start by just sharing with you at least a view of what the Internet of Things is, because I think the first challenge we have here is actually defining it. It's such a fantastic phrase, but what does it actually mean? Well, we talk about it as essentially taking data from the real world, bringing analytics to that data from whatever source it might be in the physical world, and then applying that to create multiple different outcomes. Some of them are improvements to our lives around us. Some of them are new business opportunities. Some of them are completely new ideas that didn't exist before. But the core elements of this are the ability to sense and extract data from the physical world, to be able to analyze that data, whether that's in a way that we're having to do it as humans or whether it's automated, and then ultimately to get some outcome from that. Now, that's all still pretty abstract, so let's talk about what that actually means. Well, the other reality, I think, is that we talk about IoT as though it just happened or is just happening. I think there's plenty of evidence to say we've been connecting things in the physical world for a long time now. And even, I've gone back 10 years here, but you could go back further. As long as there were devices that in some way were connecting to a network, we really had some form of IoT. I think what's important to note over this timeline is that a few things have happened. If you go from 10 years ago, a basic telematics device, to 5 years ago, we started to get the first wearables, and then now where we've got some really intelligent devices, a few things have happened that have really both spurred this development but also transformed it. One, we've seen that the integration of sensors has become much more ubiquitous It's become much more diverse. We're able to sense things at much lower cost, and we're able to add that functionality to devices. So this telematics thing had one sensor, really, a GPS chip, right? It knew where it was. You know, fast forward 5 years, and you've got a device around your wrist that not only knows where you are, but it also knows whether you're running or walking, or it can infer whether you're running or walking. It knows if it's a high-end device, what your heart rate is. It's also maybe sensing what the environment around it looks like. So sensing technology has advanced. On top of that, our connectivity technologies have advanced. We now can connect to these devices over multiple mediums. I don't think we're there yet. I think there's still plenty of new ways we need to devise to connect things, but that's made a significant difference. And then fast forward to today, what's the difference between today and 5 years ago? Well, it's not just the connectivity, it's not just the sensing, it's the intelligence that's going to be around us in the physical world. And if you take where we stand today and the level of embedded intelligence in these devices, I think it's going to pale in significance to what actually is going to come over the next 2 decades. And the fact that we have a device that can understand us through natural language, that can connect to multiple services and cause things to be delivered to our homes or services to be delivered to us, that just starts to indicate the first order of the intelligence that we can expect that IoT is going to bring to us. So we may end up not calling this the Internet of Things. I think we may end up calling it the Internet of Intelligence or the Internet of cognitive science. Who knows? But that's really what I think we're starting to see this emerge into. At McKinsey, we of course had to analyze what's going on, and some of you may have seen this. We did a big piece of work last year where we tried to look at what the potential for IoT might be. And we looked 10 years out and we said, in 2025, what do we think the full potential could be if you realized in each of the different settings the economic impact as well as the societal impact from IoT. Now, that means that some of these numbers are huge. We forecast this out to 2025, and we say if you got to the full potential impact of all of the IoT use cases that we can imagine today, we think that's in the order of trillions, and it's a big range. We think it's between 4 and 11 trillion. Now that's massive by any amount. What we're really doing here is looking at all of the opportunities to reduce waste in whatever form that waste exists around us, and also to create surplus in the form of things like, if you look at some of these dimensions, the human dimension, better quality of life, better care and longer life as a result of better outcomes that we can have from medical settings. Those have an incredible value from an economic perspective, but an even greater value from a societal perspective. And what we try to do in this work is capture both of those. Now, what we also tried to do is to say, let's look at this and this is kind of one of the important things on the slide. Let's look at this in the context of different settings. We could look at it through an industry lens or through a classic kind of industry vertical lens, but it's actually more interesting when we look at its settings, because if we're talking about things, then we're talking about places and people. And places and people interact in settings. So that's why we try to take these different dimensions here. So when you see factories there, and it looks like factories is disproportionate, right? It looks like, why would we talk about IoT anywhere except a factory? Well, the reason factories are disproportionate here is because we define a factory as anywhere where you have a well-defined set of inputs, both material information, a standard process, and a standard output. So that includes a manufacturing environment, but it also includes an agricultural setting. It also includes a healthcare a hospital where you've got standard procedures taking place. So don't be misled. When we say factories, and even though we've got a graphic that looks like a factory, we actually are thinking of a much broader range of settings. So the big message from this slide is, look, the opportunity is enormous from an economic perspective and from a societal perspective. The most important question is, how do you start to get to that? And there's obviously a lot of hype out there around IoT today. Our view is this, which is, the value really could be as great as this. The challenge in getting there is probably bigger than any one of us imagine, and that, for a few reasons that I'll mention. And I think that's really the task at hand. Certainly, it's the task that keeps me excited and motivated about this, because there's so many elements that we have to align in order to get to these kinds of outcomes. So a few different themes that I think underscore what's exciting and what's important about IoT, and we certainly see this with our clients. One is the paradigm shift that IoT offers, particularly, well, both for us as individuals and as consumers, but also in industrial and commercial settings, in organizational settings. If we can gather data from the world around us, if we can use that to predict and to infer what might happen in the future, or what patterns in the past might help us to predict what happens in the future, you can start to move to different ways of working. So we move, the classic way of representing it is to say we move, for example, from a world in which we maintain by responding to repair, by responding to when something breaks, to actually knowing when something's going to fail and being able to prevent that from happening. Not just an aircraft or a train or a piece of equipment, but also our bodies, and also our systems, right? Our financial systems. That in itself has the potential to turn the concepts of risk management on its head. So the message that we have been taking to clients, particularly here in the US when we talk about IoT, is to not get too hung up on the technologies. There's definitely, and it's definitely easy to get excited about, I can sense this thing now and I can get this data and I can do this. And what we're trying to do is to say, well, actually, let's focus on the outcome. If the outcome is safer environment around us, better outcomes in a hospital setting, or higher productivity in an industrial setting, let's focus on that, and then let's feed in the technology that delivers that. Otherwise, there's a risk of frustration, right? Otherwise, there's a risk that we all buy into technologies but don't actually have our eyes on the end goal. They've instrumented these engines to such an extent that they can now build fairly high-quality predictive models based on the data that's generated in the engine, in flight, during takeoff, during flight, during landing, to understand what the condition of the engine is, and therefore what the future condition might be under different conditions. And what that's allowed them to do is essentially be able to go to their customers, to airlines, or to the leasing companies for the planes, and say, look, we're not going to sell you an engine anymore. We're going to sell you hours of flight time. We're going to predict when this thing needs to be maintained, how it's going to be maintained, what parts need to be there. We can maximize the time in the air, and so you're going to pay us by the hour of airtime. You're not going to pay us for an asset that sits on a wing. And that's really, that's a great example of two things. It's a great example of this focus on the outcome in IoT rather than the hardware and the technology behind it. And secondly, it's a great example of being able to offer a new source of value to your customer, right? Because you've been able to actually maximize their objective function, which is the time in the air. And the same is true in health. We actually just went through this exercise with a series of clients. It started with a client who makes replacement hips and replacement knee joints. And what they wanted to do was maximize the successful outcomes from a replacement joint operation. Now, how do you do that? Well, you start by building an economic model for what the variables are that determine the time of the length of the operation, the length of the stay, the recovery afterwards, and all the costs incurred. And then you use wearables to try and instrument each of the patients to understand what their behaviors are before the operation, how their behaviors have changed after the operation, and then to stimulate them through consultation with them to actually take the measures that are going to help them to recover faster. It's already having an incredible effect, right? We're using data generated from the user to actually design the operation around them and then to design the recovery plan. It has an incredible impact in terms of their rate of recovery and in terms of the total cost of the treatment. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about what's going on, at least from a US-centric perspective around IoT. Now, the easy way to kind of split the world, the kind of the population in the US is to think about those of us as individuals and consumers, and then also to think about the commercial side of it. So I thought I'd start with what's happening in terms of IoT for us as consumers. The kind of core battleground, if you like, for most of the companies who want our attention around IoT as consumers is really in the home. I'm sure all of you have probably some version of a connected home product now in your home, whether it's a bathroom scales or a thermostat. The really interesting, I think, dynamic that's going to play out, and it's based on, we've seen it in research that we've been conducting literally in the last couple of months, is that most consumers don't care about the device. They don't care about being told that this device is smart and this one isn't, or that this device should connect to this one. They want an outcome, and they typically want an outcome that's associated with an emotion. So I'll buy an alarm, but that's a connected alarm, but I actually want to know that my family's safe or secure. or I want to have the confidence that when I'm traveling and I'm away, that if my son answers the door, that I know who he's answering the door to. Those are really emotional things that I'm trying to satisfy as much as they are practical things. And I think we're going to see this evolution, or I hope we're going to see this evolution in the connected home, which is that as consumers, we start to see offerings that are much more around addressing both the emotions that we have and also the things that we're trying to address for ourselves, rather than a device. In the US, on the more commercial side, industrial side, we've also been out doing our surveys and trying to understand who's doing what. And what we found is that we're really in the early days of adopting the industrial Internet of Things. Almost all of the industrial companies we surveyed across different sectors told us that they're still doing proof of concepts. None of them have really moved into wholesale adoption of IoT use cases in parts of their business or across their business. I don't think that's a negative message. I just think it's a reality, which is when we talk about new technologies and new opportunities, the reality is that folks, first of all, want to understand what the outcome is associated with the proof of concept, and then they want to scale it. Now, when we actually try to quantify that across different companies, and I use some examples here, there's one meaningful example I'll talk about with GE. What we found is that about 80% are still fairly nascent. Their relative understanding is relatively low in company-wide, but they are seeing pockets of innovation associated with IoT. There's about another 20% of companies who you could argue are actually trying to innovate within their business significantly. One thought, which is I think an important one, and we heard it mentioned a little bit already, is we can't think about IoT without thinking about security. I'm sure we'll have some more discussion on this evening, and we should. This is a bit of a chart that just gives a kind of more graphic sense of some of the more recent attacks. The time dimension is on the y-axis, but it reminds us that the entry point for a number of cyber attacks has been through devices, not through people. And what I mean by that is it hasn't been a result of an individual whose password was attacked or through an entry point like that. It was through a device. So the need to be sophisticated and to get mature on security and IoT is undoubtedly going to be a significant issue. And then just as a final thought to leave you with, I mean, I talked about where are we today relative to 10 years ago. I think the really exciting thing is to say, where are we going to be in 10 years' time? And I've already given some clues as to what I think is going to be important. I really do think it's going to be this theme of how we add intelligence to the data that we're gathering and how we get to the use cases that we probably can't even imagine today, but which, from a generational perspective, could have really dramatic impact for us.
So welcome, or I guess as the Japan Society, my only Japanese lesson for today, konbanwa, or if you're in Tokyo, ohayo gozaimasu. It's tough to follow a great informative McKinsey presentation by Mark here, but it's a nice segue, I think, that it sets the fundamentals here for my discussion here. We actually cover quite a few areas, so I'm glad to know that we're not in conflict on some of the fundamental issues. I hope to build on them because we actually have some very similar slides, but I actually come from a little bit of a different background, and I hope to share that from both a Japan-Asia context, but clearly from more of a cybersecurity field that Mark ended his slide with. So I think this is a good segue. And I will try to shove 22 slides in 10 minutes here, so if you'll bear with me. Just as a quick introduction for my end, personally, I actually started as an entrepreneur in med school in the US, and through many failures ended up creating one of the world's first fingerprint verification devices here. And so luckily that has become popular this day and age. Ultimately, this then spread to biometrics and then to information security in general. So I'm sure by now many of you have actually seen or used some of these products. And for me, just because of my bias, now I come to realize that I've actually been doing something called information security, now commonly known as cybersecurity, for over 25 years. So quite a long time for this area. But interestingly enough, it's just become really, really hot in just the last 24 months. What I'm really happy about, and what I really, I think, what I want to conclude today's comments about is how IoT is affecting things. But when we talk about cybersecurity, to not think of it as a negative, not to think of it as a tax, not to think of it as a burden. And I throw this as a proud example of a recent product announcement that came out about a month ago, which is this product. I don't own any shares in this company. I am not, I don't work for them. But what I'm really happy about here is this is literally an IoT device, also known as a smartphone. But what it embodies is actually two of my technologies that I helped develop. One is obviously the fingerprint unit. But I'm really also happy about is that starting next month, no, actually starting next week, you can actually use the iPhone to get on any trains or bullet trains in Japan using this by just touching the phone onto the turnstile. And this is just really an example, which I'll conclude with a similar analogy that Mark had about how IoT is actually an enabler. It actually makes things easier to use. And I want to use this as just really a case in point of how the future will actually be easier and hopefully more secure. As I was introed, I actually sold my company to this guy. Which is interesting because I actually teach now in universities in Japan, and my incoming freshman class actually doesn't know the guy on the right, which is somewhat problematic. But I want to start off here, kind of like Mark's point about the history of IoT, but let me go back a little bit further. Maybe today's present company really does not need it, but in Japan, I tend to have to explain that the internet was actually not created the last few years. A lot of Japanese, a lot of Asians tend to think that the internet came about maybe 10, maybe 20 years ago. But in reality, the internet came about from 1969. And the first internet point of a terminal is actually at my alma mater. This is the first internet terminal at, you can actually still find it at UCLA. And this made a connection to Stanford University, establishing the first internet connection in 1969. And what happened here is if you look at the adoption of the internet, and it's kind of hard to read, I apologize, but it only starts getting adopted around the year 2000, where we see a spike up in usage. And honestly, frankly, before this moment in time, the internet was really an academic tool. It was a means for open communications, collaboration, and so on. But as you can see, it wasn't really necessarily the browser that helped the internet take off. It was a critical element, but my argument is that the real spike in the internet started around 1995 with the adoption of a piece of security technology called SSL. And then you see a real kick here with a key technology that we all use in e-commerce called RSA. And my contention is that the internet is only really useful, and I know this is self-serving, but the internet is only really useful when you combine it with security. And for the first time with this combination, does it become a business tool? So I flip the common argument around that it's not IT that drives cybersecurity. It's actually cybersecurity that drives IT. And it's this paradigm shift that we need to do. Just like Mark pointed out in his presentation, the limits of IoT, the limits of our use and taking advantage of the internet really relies on the advancement of security. We cannot make things harder to use. We can't make things more complicated, more steps. We have yet to catch up on this, where right now I think we're at a crossroads in this. And so my role in the government of Japan is to really help enhance the awareness of cybersecurity. One of the things I did actually last year, which is very unusual in the Japanese government for any of you who have known, is that I helped start, I had about a year ago, an international cybersecurity conference where key players in the Japanese government played a role in this. And we actually got quite a few participants from around the world, close to over 400 people, cybersecurity experts, to discuss what the cybersecurity issues were. Putting this event together in Japan almost killed me. No one's supportive of all when you're planning this, but the moment it's over, they ask, so when's the next one? So just a small plug, for those who are interested, we will be having the second annual cybersecurity conference in Tokyo, Japan this year on this very important topic. And so to go back, let me rewind the clock a little bit. Why are we discussing this? What is the big change? What is this internet thing, and why are we so enamored about it that we have so many people here today? I really talk about it in the form of Moore's Law. And I think this is the handy reference tool that people should be aware of, and why it's interesting in human evolution right now, where because of Moore's Law, we can actually predict the future. And so if you could predict the future, you could do a lot of neat things if you could actually assume certain things will happen. And so what do we mean by Moore's Law? Moore's Law underpins something we call ICT. It is changing the world in terms of all sorts of metrics. We have various issues, whether it's disparity, conflict. A lot of it, yes, is because of ICT and its disruption that it's causing. We also see that it's also affecting the workforce. We see that obviously things like agriculture and so on aren't as intensive, that the service sector will be increasing, that manufacturing, which is key to Japan, is going down. I don't know if it's good or bad, but government's pretty safe. Talking about ICT, ICT is actually a technical terminology adopted by the United Nations to describe information communication technology. So what is Moore's Law? Moore's Law, at least my definition of it, explains how transistors, and this is a natural phenomenon, transistors will essentially decrease by half in price every 2 years, or increase in performance every 2 years, doesn't matter. But every 2 years, the mechanics of the market where we see performance or price gains is exponential. And things that are related to transistors, including communications technology, storage, and sensors, are all affected by this. We all know this, right? Because we get gigabytes on our data plans now for essentially free. We can use Dropbox for incredible gigabytes. I now know that if you go to trade shows and you get like a 5 gigabyte flash drive, no one's interested. You know, it's crazy. If I don't know what 5 gigabytes would have cost me if I was a student back when. And then sensors have dropped astronomically. The average cell phone that you all carry have about 14 sensors built in. Just a dozen years ago, that would have cost approximately $300,000, and you have more communications ability than the White House did. Now you can get it for $300, and just a few years down, it'll be $3. And so this is all due to Moore's Law. My point here is it's very tough if you're in this business individually, that we, especially in Japan, need to see how these work together to form systems and platform. So my definition of IoT at a technical level is really nothing new, really, as Mark pointed out. It's really that the price has come down significantly enough and that the performance has increased such that we could combine them in ways that just weren't possible. So if you look at most IoTs, if not all, they all have sensors that get some sort of data relatively automatically. They store this in some very cheap memory. They transmit this almost effortlessly, if not free, and they process it with supercomputer-like accuracy that would be unheard of just a few years ago. If you look at all IoT devices, they embody Moore's Law through this. Now, what concerns me, which was Mark's last slide, was that IoT stands for Internet of Things. But my concern as the cyber guy in Japan is if we keep this up and we don't address the security issue, it's soon going to meet Internet of Threats. And so I don't know, again, as well what IoT will eventually be called, but at the very least, I think we need to reterm this where it's IOST, or the Internet of Secure Things. This plug doesn't mean anything at all, but I published a book on this last year. For those Japanese who are interested, anyway. So what does Japan have to do with this? Japan is very interesting in that security is actually in its DNA. And how I talk about it is, in the mid-1970s, I use this case quite a bit, the automobile industry was actually accused of by the US government that they had to increase fuel efficiencies, emissions, safety, and so on. And they were eventually going to pass something called the Muskie Act, where they would have prohibited Japanese cars from being used in the United States, which would have been bad news. And the Japanese car industry got together and said, well, we need to really get together, and we need to make our cars better. So if you think about today, we don't buy Japanese cars because they're fast. We don't buy Japanese cars because they're cool looking. We buy Japanese cars because they're safe. You know, they work reliably. They're secure. So my point of contention here is it's actually in the DNA where you can actually sell security as an advantage. This contactless IC card, which we call Google Wallet or Apple Pay or whatever, it was actually a Japanese invention. These things as well. But I think it also poses another interesting opportunity that, as Mr. Sakura had pointed out, Japan has an elderly problem coming up. But I think that this is also an opportunity whether it comes to IoT or cybersecurity. For example, most recently, like all countries, we've had various banking and financial issues where we'd have fabricated transactions and so on. And there was one bank that implemented these kind of one-time tokens. And I came to the bank and they said, oh, no, we're okay, we're fine, we implement these tokens. And I said, well, do you know why you implement the token? And they looked at me strange. And I said, well, let's try this test. And we actually called up 100 customers in Japan, just like in a Japanese way, asked them without a script, did you receive this plastic thing we sent you last week? We want to make sure that it works and there's no problem. Can you read back the number? Can you imagine out of the 100 people we called in Japan, how many people actually read back the number? All 100. And so there are issues here, whether it's security or IoT, that are cultural context, aging context that we need to adapt to Japan. But it's not just Japan alone. Many countries will follow in this footstep. So it's a huge opportunity to look at IoT and these kind of security mechanisms in a different context or light. The problem that I have is, in the United States, I don't have to give this talk, but in Japan, one must, because in the United States, even graduate high school, you need to know how to use this thing. There is a quirk in Japan where when the PC was introduced, to input Japanese was very, very difficult. So the problem right now, which is also an opportunity to a certain extent, is that these guys run Japan, but they've never used a keyboard. So we have a quirk right now where the generation of management is actually very IT insecure, thus also cybersecurity is very difficult. So these kinds of issues make my day here. But this is not a laughing matter because at the same time, Japan is now about half of US productivity and efficiency. There are a lot of reasons for this, but I think a lot of the issues here is because of the ICT adoption or lack thereof. And so this is a concern that I have with bringing this up with the Prime Minister and talking about how we need to look at things differently. For example, we have companies that create cool products, but if you stand still, these things get asserted by new ventures from the West Coast, fruit companies, for example, that take these kind of products, put them together, and create systems. And what I'm trying to do that really ties into the IoT discussion is that we need to change from a country that makes parts, low commodities, creates products, systems, but most importantly, platforms, such as Windows and Microsoft, and things that unfortunately have not come out of Japan in the last 20 years, global players. And I see that IoT is an example of an opportunity. One, going through here quickly. The other part here is Japan had dominated in many of these technologies and was a world leader. It loses these edge when the physical manifestation of this, the monozukuri as they say, transitions to a digital context. And we lose the lead, Japan loses the lead to other countries. The next opportunity here, or an opportunity to lose, is when the digital transforms into a network kind of world. And so this is the concern where I'm driving, at least from a governmental level, the importance of networks and network economies and what IoT will play. Just an example, the world's largest media company by annual sales and revenue is a company called Facebook, yet they make no ads. A taxi company, obviously Uber, yet they don't own any cars. Hotels, Airbnb, they own no rooms. And then the largest retailer, this is usually a trick question, is actually Alibaba, yet they own no inventory. We have business model changes like this that are occurring. There was absolutely no reason why they couldn't have happened in Japan or elsewhere. These are the concerns that I have on Forum IoT. Since I'm running out of time here, I'm going to skip over this next slide and end with the slide that Mark alluded to. But we talk about cloud computing, big data, Internet of Things, blockchain, Bitcoin, driverless vehicles. They are all not possible without proper cybersecurity. And just like the engine example, we have these IoT devices that have been around for a while. The thing here is, to connect to the internet now is a given. We should all be doing this by now. What I try to stress, to build upon Mark's slide here, is that IoT enables this great management, and as he said, the business model changes. You no longer have to have capital expenditures and millions of dollars and purchasing engines. You could rent the miles. And what that allows you to do, and what I tell people, not only in the US, in Japan, and around the world, is this is a business model changer where you create new business models and new markets. In this particular example, I use the LCCs, that they would not, as an industry, have been possible without IoTs. So to connect your engines to the internet, this is now a given. It's how you extend this and create new business models and markets that I seek, and hopefully can cooperate and work with you to really create a globally and networked world. So sorry I went a little bit over, but thank you very much.
So thanks. These are great presentations. I think they're very informative. I'd like for the beginning to dial down just a tiny bit. In your own mind, what would be one or two main differences between Internet as we know it today and Internet of Things? Mark, can you?
So I think we talked about some of them. I think one of the themes is actually that with Internet, I think we decide when and how we engage it. And it's typically through a screen, either on a phone or through a tablet or a computer. And we engage it more and more. I mean, we know that there's more screen time, and more of it goes to Facebook. But we choose when we're going to engage it. Generally, I think with the Internet of Things, we're not going to have that choice always. It's going to be around. We're going to have things around us, deciding how to respond to us, or taking information about our own state or about the environment, and then presenting things to us. And the natural interaction with a screen will be replaced by the delivery of products, of services, of autonomous vehicles trying to predict and respond to us. And I think that's raised an interesting question, because you can't turn that off. Unless you choose to go and live in a cave, it's going to be hard to get away from it.
Mine is more academic because of my background, I guess. But the biggest difference, I think, with Internet and Internet of Things is the Internet had fast processing power, where you got a refrigerator-sized thing now, smaller than your watch. You have communications where you got gigabytes of free bandwidth, and you could store this on almost unlimited amounts of storage. This is the Internet, fine. The biggest difference is sensors. And for the first time in human history, up until recently, most of the data that we have in our computer systems, the storage, has been human-generated and human inputted. That it was human origin. This is the first time in human history where sensors have become so cheap, so ubiquitous, that the data is actually automated and we get stuff that we never have gotten before, i.e., humans didn't create this.
Yeah.
And so getting this information in this big deluge and how we process this, I suppose if I knew this, I wouldn't be here and I'd be starting a next venture. But it's how we process this and how we work this and how we mine this and how we AI this that will change the world forever because of the data that we have access to. I think that's a big difference between IoT and the Internet.
Okay, thanks. So I just had one more thought on top of it. When I talk to students, we have these classes and we do research on Internet of Things. One of the things that comes to my mind, it's sort of a thing where it became possible somehow to attach something, a chip, and some power source to anything that we can imagine, and make it possible to communicate into the network and to collect the data. A very, very simplistic sort of maybe physical way I look at it. That's what it meant for me. So you talked about the Moore's Law. You've talked about the Moore's Law, that's right. And so the Moore's Law, the way that we often hear about it, you sort of create a different version of it, or the different look at it, is all about the size and the number of transistors that you can pack. There is this one thing that is fascinating to me. I don't know if you have a comment on it. I've been in IC industry for a long time. The reason why Internet of Things could happen is not so much size and the number of transistors, but it's the fact that the power consumption of these things is low enough that they can actually run and do something useful.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I mean, that's one of the side effects of creating smaller transistors. But it all works as a system. So what happens is, if you have the communication speeds that you do, for example, you may think that your iDevice is very sophisticated, and it is in its own right. But in many cases, it's also a sensor in and of itself, sends the data somewhere, processes it on a larger computer, sends it back in near real time, and you don't notice. You think it's this magic box. But it's all of that, not just the transistors and the power consumption, but that heavy lifting that you could offload based on the advancements in communications, where it makes this magic look seamless. And so I think that Moore's Law is not just a transistor, it's all the other secondary effects that makes it even better.
So I mean, we didn't script it, but you just named to me when we talk about what's one of the fundamental enablers of all of these things that we imagine with IoT, I passionately believe it's going to be around, I mean, it's going to be around getting to a different power footprint, if you like, for the devices that we want to connect to the internet. For the reasons that you just described. And I'm actually going to call out your watch here, and I'm going to say, actually, it's a great user experience, but it's also an appalling user experience, because the fact that you have to charge it, how often do you have to charge it?
The Watch 2, again, I don't own any stock, is about once every 2 days.
Yeah, which is a pretty bad experience.
Pretty bad.
But great that we have the first generation of it.
Yeah.
You shouldn't have to charge it, right? And I think that's, and this, of course, right, what will mean that you have the next, or in a couple of generations' time, you don't have to charge it? Well, partly it'll be because the componentry is lower power for all of the reasons that we just talked about. Moore's Law gets us to lower power chips or to more integrated circuits. And I hope we'll also have started to figure out better methods of energy harvesting, whether they're from just, I mean, we already do energy harvesting with mechanical watches for the purposes of not having to wind them up, but translating that into more devices, I think, is going to be powerful. I think getting to, I was having this discussion this morning, actually, with one of my semiconductor clients, rethinking the architectures that we take into semiconductor manufacturing to get to ultra low power. I think those are going to be really important enablers at a more basic level. And to your point, I think Moore's Law continues to be important for all of the processing reasons you described, to handle these massive amounts of data and unstructured and ways that we want to approach analyzing the data. But we also need to be putting the same amount of effort into lower power devices.
The thing about it is, it's actually very, very hard. It's really not, it's a physics type of a problem that's really not easy to solve. Yeah. Somewhere about 4 years ago, if you were sitting in any of these integrated circuits companies that sell into mobile phones, you could have a great chip, 2 billion transistors and does magic. But the problem was that you couldn't sell it to a phone manufacturer because it was 10% more power consumption than your competitor. And by the way, they were counting, it's really interesting. People are counting microamps, when you're just listening to the signal from the base station, 1 milliamp is one number that's useful. But they would want you to count microamps, which is far below the margin of error.
You can't count it.
And that's how you lose business. It's just a fascinating thing. To me, it seemed like huge teams of people, 300, 400 people working for 3 years, and then the last 6 months or a year, the only thing that everybody works on is power consumption. It's, in my mind, that's actually really fascinating. So I work at Columbia at this point of my career. It's about education. I've spent a tremendous amount of time in the industry. But when I think about these young people who are going to do something in their future, and what do we need to educate them on? So these universities have the responsibility to teach them basic things, sciences and thinking and logic. And then when they look at the outside world, they see this company, it's Internet of Things, it's machine learning, they want some practical skills, and it's a really big challenge. How do you teach them that? And I don't know, do you have a loud thought so we're teaching engineers to do something. What should they know to be able to do this Internet of Things thing?
Well, I've been away from the U.S. for now over a dozen years now, so I don't know what the educational environment is. But one of the places I actually spend the most time right now is in the Ministry of Education, because as a society, ICT education and so on, we're falling far behind. And one of the things I complain about is because of the advancements in Moore's Law, that I don't know about the States, but in Japan and in Asia in general, the students who are elementary school students today, 65% of them, by the time they're adults, their jobs will not exist. And my concern is that we still have, in a lot of Asian cultures, this rote test-taking thing where we could remember and regurgitate kind of thing. And I think that's really silly. Why do we compete against Google? And so the education system going forward now really has to be how we bring out the humanness, how we bring out the creativity, and even that part is under assault. But we need to highlight the humanness here, because it is very counterproductive to compete against Moore's Law, and the educational system definitely is the test-based method. For me, if you could put it on a test, then a computer's going to do it better than you, and so that's a problem.
Yeah. So I agree with everything you just said, and I think there's lots of reasons to actually be quite excited and positive about this question, because and I'll come at it from a few angles. One, to answer your question directly, I think the answer lies in a combination, and a broad combination, of the fact that we're seeing hardware and software engineering going through a combined renaissance because of intelligent products and what it takes to design them. I think the opportunities around data science and where that is going to take us in terms of the systems that we can develop and that folks can build careers around is going to be incredibly exciting. And then thirdly, to your point, the design, whether we call it design or creativity, seeing that now have much more importance in not just the design of things, but in the design of process and interactions. I mean, I'm seeing it, and we're actually working really hard with our clients to introduce it. I can tell you, I'm working with some industrial clients on IoT where we're actually sort of forcing them to say, we're going to bring designers into this exercise, and you're going to experience this as if you're a consumer or a user from a design perspective. And the insights that it brings and the excitement that it brings to the creativity that it brings is incredible. And that's McKinsey, right? I mean, we're not the most creative organization in the world by any means. So I think there's a lot to be excited about in your question. And the other thing I'll share was this is the second time I'm speaking in New York this week. I'm very lucky. I presented a piece of research that I've been doing earlier this week at the AI conference, which happened on the other side of town on Tuesday. And the research we'd done was to look at, if you take data scientists working in AI and look at where are they working population-wise and what are they working on, and we did an analysis across a broad set of companies, you discover that actually almost all of that talent is going into serving you better advertisements or figuring out at Facebook how not to serve you an advertisement but still influence your behavior. And the whole thesis of our research was to say that seems valuable, but it certainly doesn't seem like the full set of problems that you can apply AI and machine learning to. So I think, back to your question, there's a whole. We basically said there's a whole set of real world problems that you can now start to crack if you've got some energy for it.
Yeah. So I'll add my perspective on it again. So I teach in the electrical engineering department. So one of the fundamental things there, you teach people about Maxwell equations which determine electromagnetic waves and radio propagation, which is really hard, okay? And then it turns out that really a very small number of students will ever need that. So there's this huge dilemma. What do you do? I mean, on the other hand, if they go if they're looking for a job, what they need to be able to do is to have enough knowledge about different software packages and libraries and connect them together and have some system knowledge. So it's a very complicated question because academically, scientifically, you're sort of pushed in the direction of teaching somewhat software skill, but I think we sort of have to do it because the number of people that need to know everything about Maxwell equations is much smaller than the number of people that need to be able to apply it. Anyway, that's my a couple of thoughts about that. So it's very exciting, the Internet of Things. Are there? I mean, you obviously talked about the major risk, the threat, Internet of threats. Is there anything other from the human perspective? What I mean, is there something we should be bothered about? Too many of these things, or too intrusive, or is that the concern that?
Well, I don't want to scare people off, but you know, the industry always goes through these evolutions and learning periods. But quite frankly, since there is little effort placed on security, that does concern me because, and I apologize, I flew over the last couple slides that talked about this, but what's really important that'll be key in an IoT era is a concept called security by design, that you can't add security as an afterthought, that it really has to be built in. And I guess I'll share the slide without the slides. But my point here was that a good example of this, it's kind of example of the IoT today, is when I was a teenager, I was the nerd, you know, working on the chess club kind of thing, and the guy next door, the teenager, was working on his Chevy or I don't know, some car, I have no idea, doing something with the engine. It's his baby on the weekends. And one day, I still remember distinctly that this thing called the car alarm comes about. And so what do people do? The guys go to the auto store and buy this car alarm, and they install this, thinking that it'll actually make their thing secure. So if you analogize the IoT with the car, the Mustang, that the kids are working on, and thinking, oh, we'll add the security later as an afterthought, you're actually not doing this. You're actually creating one more additional thing you'll lose, potentially, one additional thing that may break, one additional thing that you may have to charge. And by the way, if you do it in the wrong order, you create a neighborhood disturbance. And you don't get all that great a security. Whereas where we need to go, and again, I'm using the auto industry in Japan again, is today if you buy a high-end car, not even a high-end car, a normal car, you get two remotes, a him and a her remote. And if you look at some of these IoT systems in cars, they're now sophisticated where the wife on the weekdays, this is maybe a Japan analogy, but on the weekdays, the wife will drive the kids to school and so on and open the car door. The seat will adjust to her height, the temperature to her temperature, the radio channels to her radio channels, the map to her channels, even to the language, for example, Japanese in one mode and English, and drive. The husband will then drive on the weekends, use the same remote. The seats will automatically change to his height, the temperature to his temperature, and so on. Now, the point I want to make there is the remote control for this car is an incredible security device. But I'll tell you, no one thinks about it in that context. They think of it as a convenience device. And because they think about security through design, they're able to offer these additional benefits and features and frills that is only possible through designing this. And so IoT is going through the transition of a bunch of teenagers creating a cool product, adding security later, and then kind of having to manage as Frankenstein, versus we will get to companies, smart companies, who go, oh, security is actually a benefit that'll make my products and service better. We're in that transition.
Yeah, I love the analogy of the cool product, and then we'll fit the alarm afterwards. It's very interesting. Clearly the issue of security and IoT, we both mentioned it. We're both majoring on it. We're doing some work right now with the Global Semiconductor Alliance, which is almost all the semiconductor companies, purely around the topic of IoT and security. And the reason I talk about it is because it's an open collaboration. And there's a couple of interesting themes that I'll preview from that work. One of the themes that we find is almost consistently the technology to address the threat lags the threat in almost every situation. And what does that mean? It means that we're on the treadmill and we're not catching up on the treadmill, which frames, I think, on the security side, an interesting question, which is actually we should accept that there are entities, that there are individuals that will continuously try to find ways into and try and find I'm sure this is, you're much deeper than I am on this, but that will continuously be trying to find ways into and to try and break whatever it is that we create. With IoT, there may be an opportunity, I'm just hypothesizing, there may be an opportunity to try and turn that paradigm on its head, because if you take the perspective of society and how we address security in society, first of all, most of us want to adhere to a set of norms that if we adhere to will allow us to operate and have the benefits of being part of society. That might actually be a model for how we approach IoT. If you want to have the benefits of sharing data and of being part of that, you have to show that you're trustworthy. And when you show that you're not trustworthy, maybe there are certain rights that disappear, which is a different model to I have to secure everything, and until I secure everything, no one can actually do anything in that model. So I think what's interesting and what's coming out of some of the work we're doing is actually thinking about it less from a technology perspective and from a provisioning of technology, but more from what are the constructs that you're even going to work under when it comes to actually creating devices and creating interoperability.
Thank you. So one where we didn't mention too much was data. It was mentioned, but I think that the way you presented it is the outcomes. You don't care about the devices, and you said it's really the outcomes. Somewhere in between these devices and these outcomes is the data. And I don't know, is there something you want to say about the data or in the context of IoT? Or
I mean, I'll make a couple of words, and I'm sure William has some thoughts. I think it's I'll focus on one aspect of the data that I think is quite interesting. I mean, of course, it's the data. And the data, you said it earlier when we talked about what's different between IoT and the internet. The data is much more diverse. A lot of it is garbage. I mean, we might as well be honest about that, right? Every day I meet someone who says, oh, the data that comes off my device is so valuable, I'm going to sell it to 20 people. And you're like, really? I'm not sure. So I think and a lot of it is unstructured. It doesn't get well captured. It is without, and so two themes that I think come out. One, without context, a lot of this data is not actually that useful. And this figuring out of how do you add context to data from a technical perspective and also from a conceptual perspective, I think is a really important theme that folks will have to crack as they get into IoT in a meaningful way. I think the second thing is then data rights. And a lot of the early discussions that we're having, particularly in a commercial context, are around how are folks going to make their data available. The jet engine is a great example, right? Does the data coming off the jet engine belong to the jet engine manufacturer, the airline, or does it actually belong to the leasing company who's financing the jet engine and the aircraft? And that in itself, I think, is a really interesting set of problems, particularly because the reaction that most companies and individuals have right now is it's my data and I own it, and no one can have their hands in it. And if we all have that attitude, we're going to slow down the creativity and we're going to slow down the diversity of what we can actually do here.
Yeah, no, I agree. I actually sit on one of an airline's board, and their kind of slight complaint is that to your question, that I'll tell you, one of the engine manufacturers that we both mentioned, I won't mention which one, will not now release the data. Right. That they will sell you the maintenance advice. They will tell you this and that. So it all goes through the airlines. Airlines can't see it, through the airports, to the engine manufacturer. And so, yeah, the service model is changing, but the benefits from that apparently, obviously, far outweigh that. So there aren't that issues. But I think that, yeah, we're going to go through some hard times here, especially with medical records and especially cloud data. Because if you read the fine print for some of this stuff, the moment, for example, you put it on, I won't mention who, but you put it on some cloud devices or social media sites, they're actually the owners of this data. Which may or may not be fine. But the other issue, which we're now starting to see, is that data should be portable and you move from provider A to provider B. This is fine. And we see this in mobile. We go from an Android to an iPhone back to an Android. It's relatively painless. Mm-hmm. We'll start doing this more and more in the cloud levels, and we'll want that portability. But we're having issues now where we're seeing, we're worried about privacy and snooping and all this, but now the issue is if we switch providers, you look at the agreements and there's actually no requirements for them to delete the data. And so, how the laws and legislations have definitely not kept up, or you're not reading the EULAs, but yes, there's going to be some issues that I think are going to become more prevalent before they settle down.
Yeah, okay. So let's do one more thing before we go into Q&A. I think for those of us who are involved in IoT, we're pretty convinced it's happening and things are moving on. So what might be one or two things that may be most beneficial 10 years from now to humanity because IoT happened? Is there something you could think of? I mean, what is the most socially beneficial aspect of it?
Yes, I'll start. We're already living in a very IoT world. The automobile that you've purchased in the last year or two, that's just a computer on wheels. You know, your refrigerator is a computer that cools things. Your TV is really a display with a computer in the back. And so we're living this world. I think the big change that you're going to see with Moore's Law in the exponential phase is that this data that we're now having a bunch of dots producing data. We're able to connect them a little bit, but how we interpret this and we create new services and do that intelligently is, I think, going to change things. So, for example, back to the airline example, you know, working such that if you have an early flight to New York from Haneda, but the flight's delayed, that I envision a situation where it's smart enough that your alarm clock gets pushed so that you can sleep a few more hours, and that your Uber comes at that right moment without having to do anything. Yeah. And so these kind of things, you know, our grandkids will look back and go, wait, you had to actually set the alarm clock, kind of thing. And so these kind of things will dramatically change. Now, if I knew what they were, again, I wouldn't be here and probably starting a startup.
I mean, I agree entirely. I think our kids, not even necessarily our grandkids, will say, like, you guys, like, really did, like, you ordered the Uber, it didn't just come and then you didn't just wave it by. And I think inevitably, when you ask the question the way you asked it, it's very hard not to think about the things that are most immediate to us, really, right? In terms of our own safety and the personal safety of our families and our own health. I mean, to me, those are the two greatest things that I think we can actually all look forward to, the fact that you'll have better outcomes in that respect. The concept that a child would never step into the road and get hit by a car because both the car, the environment, and something on the child have made sure that that doesn't happen, that to me is, I mean, that's both feasible and incredible, and that's what we should be excited about.
Okay, just an example along those lines. So one of the things that some of my students were working on is if you are using a bicycle in New York City, and there is this thing called, I guess that's the name, dooring. You know, somebody gets out of the taxi and you slam it. So the idea is, how do we make it not happen? How do we facilitate that? That's possible, actually. Totally possible, yeah. That's an example.
We could also give all those people helmets, which would be a good start in terms of...
Okay, very nice. So we'd like to engage the audience here in a little bit. If you have a couple of questions, concerns, or please go ahead. Yeah? Yes?
I think the mic will come around here.
Yes, we have a microphone.
Thank you. Very interesting presentation, gentlemen. One of the things that we discussed is you've kind of bifurcated IoT into a number of verticals. And I think if we look at some massive consumer verticals now, search, e-commerce, whatnot, you tend to get a winner-take-all type scenario. I'm just curious your take. Number one, if in these various IoT verticals it will emerge as sort of winner-take-all or a dominant player. And then what are some of the key what are some of the key variables that will contribute to a winner? I mean, what competitive advantages can we look to? You mentioned a GE or whatnot. Who are the beneficiaries, and what are going to be the factors that enable them to win in the end?
So I can start. I mean, I think, at least for simplicity's sake, I'm going to separate kind of consumer world from industrial world. I think the industrial world, I mentioned GE quite deliberately as an example. I mean, so I agree there is a pattern of winner takes all, and so why wouldn't that repeat itself in this case around certain application areas? I think what we're seeing with GE, for example, going after the industrial Internet of Things is essentially an effort, or it started as an effort to create a platform that has many of the hallmarks of an Apple model applied to industrial, right? In the sense that it's got an application enablement element to it. It's got an app store. You know, you're within a walled garden in terms of where the data goes, and the fact that it's all GE. Whether that's successful or not, I think in the industrial world is going to be driven by a couple of things. One, I think there's a dynamic in the industrial world where there's a decent number of large companies that were fairly wary of someone like a GE, who they already depend on to a large extent or compete with to a large extent, becoming their only enabler for this digital transformation. And so I think there's frankly a set of commercial factors more than technology that's playing against it. I also think that there's a diversity. I mean, I think that the very nature of the Internet of Things is that there's a diversity in terms of the applications that make it harder to align folks to a single approach. Having said that, and this is one of the things that I think is quite exciting. I mean, if we went back 15 years and sat here and said, what's going to be, who's going to on the internet, who's going to own the internet? There were lots of folks saying, I'm going to dominate it, right? I mean, AOL, Time Warner, all these guys. Well, no one sat here and said there's going to be a social network and this thing called Facebook. So I think the exciting thing about IoT is, at some point, we are going to have the Facebooks of IoT. Now, it may well be Facebook for a little while, but I think there will be other applications and other things that we probably can't even contemplate today that will become, at least on the consumer side, I hope, and the platforms. But it's probably going to be a platform around something. What that actually is, we've probably yet to see.
Well, I think my quick answer is that history will show that for every IBM or Microsoft or Dell, DEC, innovation is quite vicious, and so it's imperative that the leaders stay leaders, but they tend to change. And one of the biggest things that I see right now is two things. IoT levels the playing field. So what I tell young people in Japan now is that unlike a generation or two ago, when you wanted to build something, you could just do things with your fingertips. You don't have to build a factory or wait, X month for supply chains. We live in an incredible world where we could outsource all the pieces, create an IoT device the next day, and sell it on some marketplace the day after. And so that speed and the global nature of this fundamentally changes that assumption. And the other thing I would throw out there is all these things that we think are market leaders in this area, whether it's a Facebooks or whatever, there are Chinese equivalents that are catching up, if not already exceeded. So I would not be complacent because this is definitely now a global marketplace, and because you can't read the language shouldn't mean that it doesn't exist.
Okay, let's go there.
Hi. Do you see the GE model of subscription-based transactions moving into the consumer space as well? When my connected fridge sees that I have no more milk, will it order it for me?
I think there are fridges that actually do that already, especially in Asia. I actually know one where you put the food in and it'll actually automatically scan the barcode, and it's convenient because you go to the supermarket, you know what you're low on, and and the expiration dates and such. So such things exist. I think that you start to see more service models because it's easier on the consumer, where you pay as you use, for example. And that goes really from where you don't have a huge capex in terms of a box that you need to sell or something. I think because of the IoT and ICT and what that allows you, you're just sending bits. So if I sell it for a penny, it's almost pure profit anyway. And so I think that model, we're seeing a change. I don't know where the trajectory is, but it's definitely different.
Yeah. I think, to your point, there's products they're doing today. I think there's two really interesting elements behind the question, which is one, will we allow the appliances to start to, how much of our lives will we allow the appliances to start to take a lead without at least, first of all, suggesting it to us? And secondly, how much of this, at least in the US, will we cede to, will we and the fridge manufacturer and the other device manufacturers cede to Amazon? Because the example you just described, by far the dominant fulfillment platform today is Amazon, whether it's for groceries or other products. And I think that's the other, at least in the home and around the consumer, it's going to be an interesting battle. If you're the fridge manufacturer, how on earth do you stay relevant in that whole picture?
So we have too many hands, so make it a little bit more intimidating. You have to introduce yourself when you ask the question. Let me try this side. Would you like to go ahead, please? Yes, you. The gentleman in blue. You. With red tie.
Thank you. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm John Allen from Greater China Corporation, and we are working on the Internet of Global Financial Markets, so with the financial side. And my question relates to the security aspects of these things. I'll give you 3 quick examples of things we're working on. One is a global currency market, and this came out of Bretton Woods, and it is based on 5 baskets. It's based on currencies, precious metals, industrial metals, energy securities, and agricultural securities, all in one basket. You can go into and out of that at a moment's notice, all because of the contemporary speed of the internet. The second one is labeling. It's the DNA of financial instruments and organizations, so that every organization that has like a corporation or a limited partnership, everything has a unique identity, like DNA, and every financial instrument, like a stock or a bond or a derivative, has an identity, so you can link these together. The third is what you can call a global financial center, like the UN down the road. You know, that's not part of the US, but it can be virtual, and it's where international patents, international securities can be traded 24/7. You can have contracts, you can have financial statements in these global currencies. So we're working on all of these things, all because of the IoT. But my question is, how will the security aspects impact those 3 markets?
Security.
Yeah. Well, no, at the end of the day, you need to gain the trust of the consumer so that you could use it without worrying about integrity issues, availability issues, non-repudiation. So these aren't simple issues, but so money, coins and cash are actually incredible innovation, because if I give a bill to you, it suddenly leaves my hands and such. And so the virtual manifestation of this, whether it's blockchain or Bitcoin or whatever, it's still very, very difficult. And so the mathematical security aspect of this is not too difficult. It's just really getting around more on the usability and the transparency and really gaining the trust. And so it's actually not technical reasons versus more psychological and societal reasons that are limiting this. It's not a technical security issue from where I stand.
Yeah, no, I agree. Very consistent with what I thought I was saying.
Okay. Would you like to go ahead in the white shirt?
Hi, thank you very much. A very fascinating talk. A lot of the conversations...
You have to introduce yourself,
Oh,
otherwise you lose the
My
right.
name is Mark Carroll. I work as a designer at a company called Isobar, which is part of Dentsu. So a lot of the conversation has been sort of steeped in sort of human-to-machine interaction. But a lot of this Internet of Things is really about augmenting our environments and measuring and learning more and having it respond to us. Do you have any thoughts about... with all of these different systems of infrastructure being augmented, will it come to a point where eventually we have to sort of think about how they interoperate with one another? And can you think of maybe any sort of unintended consequences, some interesting things that might happen because of the fact that we have now machine-to-machine sort of communicating with one another and making decisions about things, about our environments?
I mean, I'm happy to offer some thoughts. I think this takes us into the question around artificial intelligence as much as it takes us into the question of IoT, and I do think the two come together, right? Because we're saying we connect physical things and then some intelligence somewhere, whether it's in those things or in the cloud and applied to those things, has the potential to start driving outcomes that we haven't defined, but that it thinks are the right outcomes to pursue. And so that takes us into the whole debate, of course, around AI and what the risks or potential implications of AI are. I'm not a big. I personally think the term M2M, machine to machine, which was a precursor for IoT in some respects, is a complete misnomer, because we actually rarely connected machines to machines. We typically connected them to some other system which we had defined rules in, which then the fact that multiple things were connected, it became machine to machine. And I continue to think it's a bit of a misnomer when we get into IoT as well, because the reality is that almost everything that we're talking about in the IoT is either connecting at some level into the cloud or at some level into some higher level of processing, might be in a gateway or wherever architecturally, where something's going to take place around either a set of rules that we've defined for it or under a construct of what those of rules that can be generated will exist. And so certainly there can be unintended consequences, and they can be basic unintended consequences, right? I mean, yeah, of course, we could have autonomous vehicles for which we haven't defined the right construct for it to learn and for the model-based learning to occur, where it therefore starts to take actions that we didn't contemplate. And I think that is absolutely inevitable. I think that's absolutely one of the reasons why we won't get to full autonomy quite as quickly as we'd like to, or why we'll have challenges with full autonomy. I think at the extreme end of that, the consequences of the idea of the brain or the computer taking over and starting to make these decisions that are somehow acting outside the bounds of what you'd want to do in a reasonable society. I'm much less worried about that. I'm more worried about the fact that we'll be immature in the way that we design systems today. We won't contemplate the corner cases of their operation, and it will be simple operations, but they'll fail us when we need them to fail, when we didn't intend for them to fail, or we didn't contemplate them failing us. And I'll give you a silly example, right? But the door locks, right? The automated door locks, August and those guys, it's a great product. But there will be corner cases of interaction between that and other devices in the home that can lead to a situation where the door unlocks or locks someone in the home and has a consequence that you really didn't want and is really potentially dangerous. And I think that's what we've got to be more worried about in the short term.
So 2 quick examples that shows the latest and greatest today in IoT. One is for automated driving. It is now possible to have an auction-based machine-to-machine system where if you say, my budget is X, $5, it will actually negotiate with the car in front of you to tell it to move to the left so you could pass it and deduct it via Bitcoin or whatever and make a transaction so that if you're in a rush and you have a certain budget, the car will automatically pass and drive faster for you. So this is a reality today. The other one, from a human-to-machine interface one that is public and is a DARPA one that I found interesting, was a merge of the F-35 program, strike fighter, and it takes about 6 months for a normal pilot to be able to fly an F-35. Put that aside. There are now, because of Moore's law, sensors that allow you to measure brain functions very accurately. And so I had this great idea of, why don't you merge the two? So we got this brain writer. It was part of a paraplegic 40-year-old lady, normal lady, no flight experience whatsoever. It took her about 12 hours to be able to fly, not land and take off the F-35, but fly the F-35 by plugging in this thing into a USB port into the simulator. And so to be able to learn and use the adaptive AI in the middle, to be able to have a normal human being use a brain connection without hands or anything to fly an airplane. Now, as a segue, my problem with Japanese innovation is they'll make something that will create a human interface where you use traditional joysticks and things. And so we need to get beyond that, and we could skip that inefficient component. And so we have to look and skip generations of IoT and see how we connect. So that's just the latest and greatest.
Okay. For some diversity, do we have a lady that has a question maybe? Yes or no? Raise your hand. No? Okay. I want to go somewhere there. Did somebody raise your hand? Go ahead. Yeah. Okay, perfect.
My name is Gabriela Ciocărlie. I'm from SRI International, Stanford Research Institute in the old times. You mentioned the ARPANET. That was us, yep. Not me, but us. So I'm curious what you think about privacy. You mentioned a little bit about privacy. I do research in security and privacy, but I want to see a little bit your angle on privacy when we talk about IoT. In particular, when we talk about Internet of Threats, how you see the impact on privacy?
Oh, that's such a subjective term. It's difficult. It's how you interpret it. For me, really, I think we live in an area where we make that trade-off and there's no privacy, unfortunately. And you should probably be aware of that expectation. The problem that I have is well-meaning companies, I won't name the manufacturers, but we have TVs now that have cameras built in. Many of you don't know this. But they're camera built in so that you could, so that the television can turn off when no one's in the room, can change the lighting, whatever. But they're cameras, several megapixels in front of the camera. Well, it's troublesome when hackers find out when you do this, and so that they could actually take a picture of you when you're in front of your TV, which could be troublesome because, one, you don't know there's a camera, and maybe we're not in the best of situations when we're in front of the TV. So these are the privacy issues that I think we need to head off. The more societal issues and debates and stuff, that's just another session, I think. Maybe Japan's societal host.
Yeah, I agree. It's subjective. My interpretation is privacy is just a trade-off with utility, but that we do it at an individual level and at a societal level. At some point, we invited a one-way invasion of our privacy with direct marketing, right? But before we had the internet, we still do get things through our letterbox that are addressed to us and that somehow know something about us. With the internet, from a generational perspective, we've embraced, a handing over of our privacy and our information in order to get all the benefits. And I think with IoT, we'll just face a similar level of generational trade-offs around the utility that you can get from IoT relative to the amount of information that you have to share about yourself. And I think one of the battlegrounds, if you like, for this is clearly going to be in health. Faced with the opportunity to have a better health outcome for yourself or for other people you care about, I think that the question of privacy will very quickly become a background issue. Now, the question is, what would you share from a privacy perspective to benefit others that you don't know? And I think that's one of the things that we're going to face. And with most things on the internet, it happens before you actually make a choice about it. And then you find, either I want to claw it back or actually I like the benefits and I'm not actually that bothered about it.
Okay, so the hosts have a reception for us, and we cannot take any more questions. But Mark and William, thank you so much. This was excellent.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.